Mick Doran and Ryan Callaghan weren't just names whispered in fear, they were legends carved into the streets of Liverpool, men whose rise from poverty to power turned entire neighborhoods into their kingdom of drugs, money, and blood. The streets of Liverpool in the late 1990s told two very different stories. In the city centre, the skyline began to change as cranes rose over the Mersey, promising new hope and modern life. But away from the waterfront, in places like Kirkdale, Dingle, and Norris Green, another world existed. It was a world built on unemployment, broken families, and silent anger. Terraced houses stood like rows of forgotten soldiers, their walls scarred by decades of neglect. For the young men growing up there, dreams of success were distant fantasies. Most believed the only way out was through crime, a fast car, easy money, and respect earned through fear. Among these streets, two boys learned early that survival meant power. Mick Doran and Ryan Callaghan were inseparable. They came from different families but shared the same story: absent fathers, overworked mothers, and a constant struggle to escape poverty. As teenagers, they spent their days running small errands for older gang members, delivering packages and collecting debts. What started as simple tasks soon became lessons in control, intimidation, and manipulation. By 16, they knew how the streets worked. They watched how drug dealers commanded fear and respect, how cash could silence loyalty, and how violence solved every problem faster than words ever could. Mick was the quiet one, calculating and patient. He studied people, their weaknesses, their greed, their desperation. Rex, on the other hand, was the enforcer. Larger, unpredictable, and dangerous, he thrived on chaos. Together, they were a perfect balance, brains and brutality. Their rise began with something small: a handful of pills stolen from a club dealer and sold to local kids for double the price. When no one came looking for the stolen stash, they did it again. Then again. Soon they realized they could run their own operation. The late 90s saw a wave of cheap cocaine and heroin flood into Britain, and Liverpool became one of the main entry points. Shipments came through the docks, hidden inside imported goods, and local gangs competed fiercely for control. Mick and Rex found themselves working for a mid-level dealer known only as the Turk. He recognized their ambition and used them to manage street-level operations. Within months, the pair doubled the profits and eliminated competitors using sheer intimidation. Their methods were brutal, but effective. No one dared cross them. Every pound they earned went back into growing their business: new contacts, burner phones, lookouts, and vehicles. They understood the streets like no one else, and began building something much larger than anyone expected. But beneath their success lay the seeds of destruction. Every move they made attracted attention. The police began monitoring their neighborhoods closely, collecting information about a sudden surge in drug activity. Residents whispered their names in fear. Parents warned their sons to stay away from the Doran and Callaghan boys. Yet many secretly admired them. To some, they were villains. To others, they were proof that power could come from nothing. By the dawn of the new millennium, Mick and Rex were no longer small-time hustlers. They were the emerging kings of Liverpool's underworld, and their empire was only beginning to rise. By the early 2000s, Liverpool's criminal landscape had started to shift. The smaller street dealers, who once ruled corners, were either gone, locked up, or working for bigger syndicates. At the top of this new structure stood Mick Doran and Ryan Callaghan. What began as a small neighborhood operation had grown into a network that stretched across the city. Their grip tightened with every deal, every debt collected, and every threat carried out. They controlled the nightlife scene: bars, clubs, and security firms that acted as fronts for drug distribution. Bouncers moved packets of cocaine as easily as they checked IDs, and taxi drivers delivered drugs to customers' doors. It was a system built on fear and silence, and it worked perfectly. Mick handled the logistics, running the operation like a businessman. He was organized, cold, and smart enough to stay one step ahead of the police. Rex, meanwhile, ensured loyalty through violence. Anyone who tried to cheat them disappeared, often without a trace. Their reputation grew quickly. Other dealers knew that once you started working under Mick and Rex, there was no way out. They took a share of every sale, controlled the supply, and made sure no rival group could move product without their approval. The city was divided into zones, each overseen by a trusted lieutenant. The profits rolled in faster than either of them had imagined. With the money came power, and with power came greed. Mick wanted more than local dominance. He began seeking ways to import cocaine directly, instead of relying on intermediaries. His chance came through a connection with a Manchester-based trafficker who had links to Spain's southern coast, a key entry point for drugs from South America. This partnership changed everything. Mick's operation now had access to high-quality cocaine at wholesale prices, bypassing the smaller suppliers completely. Shipments arrived hidden in fruit containers, furniture, and even car parts. From Liverpool, the drugs spread across the northwest, feeding an ever-growing demand. The profits became staggering. Mick and Rex laundered their money through real businesses, car washes, construction firms, and property investments. They bought flashy cars, wore expensive suits, and hosted charity events to mask their criminal empire. On the surface, they appeared to be successful entrepreneurs. Behind the scenes, they built one of the most efficient and violent drug networks in Britain. Their influence extended beyond the city. Gangs from Birmingham and Glasgow began dealing with them, paying high prices for their product. Liverpool was no longer just another city in the drug trade. It had become one of its main hubs. But success brought new dangers. The more money they made, the more enemies they created. Rival gangs envied their control, and whispers began circulating that some were planning to challenge their rule. Mick dismissed the threats, believing fear was enough to protect him. He didn't realize that in the criminal world, fear always fades, and ambition never sleeps. What they built seemed untouchable, but in reality, it was standing on unstable ground, one betrayal, one mistake away from collapse. The empire they had fought so hard to create was about to face its first real test. The docks of Liverpool had always been the heart of the city's trade, a lifeline that connected Britain to the world. But by the mid-2000s, those same docks had become the gateway for something darker. Hidden among the cargo containers of fruit, textiles, and electronics came tons of cocaine and heroin from South America and the Middle East. It was through these waters that Mick Doran and Ryan Rex Callaghan built their empire, using the same routes that once made Liverpool rich through legitimate trade. Every shipment that arrived meant more power, more money, and more control. But it also drew the attention of rivals who wanted a piece of what they had created. The first challenge came from a group in Speak, known for their violent reputation. They began undercutting prices, selling cheap cocaine imported through their own connections in Spain. At first, Mick tried to ignore them, hoping the newcomers would make mistakes and destroy themselves. But when one of his couriers was found beaten and robbed, he knew the situation couldn't be ignored. In Liverpool's criminal world, weakness was an invitation for chaos. To keep control, Mick decided to strike first. He gathered his most trusted men and planned a retaliation that would send a message to the entire city. Late one night, a rival shipment was due to arrive at the docks. Hidden in crates of ceramic tiles, the drugs were to be collected by two of the Speak gang's men. What they didn't know was that Mick's crew had already been tipped off. As the rivals loaded the cargo into their van, a black SUV approached from the shadows. Within seconds, gunfire echoed through the cold night air. The attack was quick and ruthless. Both men were left dead, their bodies dumped into the water. The next morning, when the news broke, no one claimed responsibility, but everyone knew who had ordered it. The message was clear: challenge Mick and Rex, and you disappear. The violence didn't stop there. Over the next few months, several small dealers allied with the Speak gang. Some were found in abandoned warehouses, others never seen again. Fear spread through the city like wildfire. Mick and Rex had made themselves untouchable. Their network extended deep into the docks, with crane operators, truck drivers, and customs officials all on their payroll. Every shipment that came through was protected, and every problem was silenced before it could reach the surface. The police knew something was happening, but couldn't prove it. The murders were clean, the evidence scarce, and witnesses refused to talk. The only clues were whispers in the pubs and alleyways about the dock killings. While the authorities struggled to piece together what was going on, Mick's empire grew even stronger. But beneath the success, paranoia began to take root. Each act of violence made them more powerful but also more visible. The dockside bloodshed had made them legends in Liverpool's underworld, yet it also marked the beginning of a dangerous spiral, one where every victory came with a cost, and every move pushed them closer to the fall they couldn't yet see coming. For years Mick Doran and Ryan Rex Callaghan had run their empire with precision. They trusted only a small inner circle, men who had proven their loyalty through fear and blood. Among them was Sean Malloy, a sharp, quiet figure who had been with them since the early days. Sean handled distribution, money transfers and coordination between suppliers and street dealers. To Mick, he was dependable, someone who got things done without asking questions. But what Mick didn't know was that Sean had already chosen survival over loyalty. After being caught in a sting operation involving stolen firearms, Sean faced decades in prison. The National Crime Agency saw an opportunity and offered him a deal, freedom in exchange for information. At first, Sean resisted. He knew what happened to informants. Their families disappeared, their names were erased from the streets. But months in isolation and the fear of a lifetime behind bars broke him. Quietly, he began feeding the authorities small pieces of information, minor names, drop-off points, and low-level deals. Nothing too valuable at first, just enough to build trust. But the investigators were patient. They knew the path to dismantling the Doran Callaghan empire would come from the inside. Sean was their ticket. While the police slowly gathered intelligence, Mick and Rex continued expanding. They had operations stretching from Liverpool to Leeds and Manchester, moving drugs across the northwest with military efficiency. Money flowed in faster than they could launder it. Mick began using offshore accounts in Cyprus and Dubai, while Rex focused on enforcing control on the streets. To outsiders, everything looked unshakable. But Sean's betrayal had already started to eat through the structure like a hidden rock. He provided exact details of shipment schedules, coded communications, and cash movements. Each report he passed helped the NCA map out their network in secret. Sean was careful not to raise suspicion. He kept his distance from direct deals and avoided conversations about logistics when others were around. But Mick had begun to notice small things, a lost shipment here, a missed payment there. He blamed carelessness, never imagining that the leak was sitting across the table from him. Rex, more paranoid and short-tempered, wanted to interrogate everyone. Mick told him to stay calm, believing control meant patience. Yet that patience would become his greatest mistake. The authorities, meanwhile, watched and waited. They wanted to strike at the right moment, not to arrest a few dealers, but to dismantle the entire organization in one blow. Sean's information painted a picture of a syndicate built on intimidation and greed, a machine that seemed unstoppable from the outside. What made it even more dangerous was how normal it all appeared. Businesses, warehouses, and shipping firms, all operating under legal facades. No one outside the underworld suspected the scale of what was happening. But as Sean's information deepened, the walls began to close in. Mick and Rex, still believing they were untouchable, didn't realize that the biggest threat wasn't a rival gang or a police raid. It was the quiet man standing beside them, slowly delivering their empire to the very people determined to destroy it. By 2009, Mick Doran was at the height of his power. His network stretched from Liverpool's streets to international borders. Money flowed through offshore accounts, property deals, and luxury businesses that looked legitimate on paper. Yet even at the top, Mick craved more. He wanted a deal so big it would cement his place as one of Britain's most successful traffickers. That deal came in the form of a shipment from South America, a consignment worth more than 10 million in pure cocaine. It was to arrive through Spain, hidden among imported goods before being transported through the docks of Liverpool. It was risky, but if successful, it would make him untouchable. Mick planned every detail carefully. The shipping documents were forged to perfection, customs officials were paid off, and several decoy containers were arranged to distract authorities. He left nothing to chance. Rex, although increasingly unpredictable due to heavy drug use, was tasked with overseeing the transfer once the shipment arrived. Everything seemed flawless. Yet behind the scenes, Sean Malloy, the trusted lieutenant who had secretly turned informant, had already passed the entire plan to the National Crime Agency. Every code word, every route, every handler, the NCA knew it all before a single crate left the docks in Spain. Days before the arrival, surveillance teams were deployed along the Mersey. They monitored vans, boats, and warehouses linked to Mick's operation. The authorities were patient, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. When the container finally arrived, marked under the name of a fake import company, police and customs officers raided the dockyard. Inside, they discovered hundreds of kilos of cocaine sealed within pallets of ceramic flooring. The bust was one of the largest in Liverpool's history. The news spread across the city like wildfire, 10 million worth of drugs seized, dozens arrested, and connections traced to international suppliers. For Mick, it was a devastating blow. He lost not only money, but credibility. The street whispered about betrayal. Someone inside had leaked information. Furious, Mick launched a brutal internal cleanup. He interrogated his men, shut down warehouses, and demanded loyalty oaths from everyone in his inner circle. Those he suspected vanished. Innocent men were killed because of his paranoia. Rex tried to calm him, but his own instability made things worse. Trust became a rare currency. Even longtime allies began keeping their distance. Behind closed doors, Mick's empire began to fracture. Payments were delayed, suppliers hesitated to send new shipments, and police pressure intensified. The NCA had struck hard, but they weren't finished. Every arrest and confiscated asset gave them more leads. Yet Mick refused to believe the betrayal came from Sean. To him, Sean was family, loyal, efficient, and unshakable. The idea that his closest ally was the source of his downfall never crossed his mind. The £10 million shipment marked a turning point. What was once an unbreakable empire was now cracking under fear and suspicion. Mick's control over the city began to slip, and for the first time in years rivals started circling like vultures. What he didn't know was that this was only the beginning of his collapse, a chain reaction set in motion by a man he still trusted with his life. The months following the failed shipment were chaos. What had once been a tightly run operation began to unravel piece by piece. The air around Mick Doran's empire grew tense, heavy with suspicion and fear. His men no longer trusted one another, and whispers of betrayal spread through every corner of Liverpool's underworld. At the center of it all, Ryan Rex Callaghan, once the iron fist of the organization, was spiraling out of control. Years of cocaine use had taken their toll. The man who had once been Mick's most reliable enforcer had turned reckless, paranoid, and dangerously unpredictable. Rex began making rash decisions, handling deals personally and ignoring Mick's cautious strategies. He thought he could regain their lost reputation by flooding the streets with product again, but his desperation only attracted attention. Undercover officers already monitoring the group closely saw an opportunity. One night in Manchester, Rex arranged a deal with a new supplier, or so he thought. In reality, the meeting was part of an elaborate sting operation. The warehouse he entered was bugged, the cash marked, and the supposed buyers were law enforcement officers. As soon as the exchange began, armed police stormed in. Rex tried to run, but within seconds he was on the ground, surrounded and handcuffed, with kilos of cocaine and bundles of cash spread out beside him. His arrest sent shockwaves through the entire organization. For years, the name Callaghan had been enough to keep people silent. Now, photos of Rex's arrest plastered newspapers, and his mugshot dominated the evening news. It was the first public crack in their empire, and Mick knew the walls were closing in. He tried to use lawyers, bribery and threats to get Rex released, but the police had too much evidence, recordings, surveillance footage and money trails linking him directly to the operation. After months of investigation, Rex was sentenced to 20 years in prison. The ruling was a death blow to his spirit and a devastating hit to Mick's control. With Rex gone, Mick stood alone. The unity that once made them untouchable had been destroyed. Old enemies began testing the boundaries, moving in on territories once protected by Rex's fearsome reputation. Mick fought to keep his dominance, but every week brought new challenges. Some of his lieutenants defected to rival gangs, taking customers and money with them. Others vanished, likely cooperating with the police to save themselves. The trust and brotherhood that had built the empire were gone. Mick's mental state began to crumble. He stopped sleeping, grew paranoid, and rarely left his fortified home in Formby. He suspected everyone, drivers, dealers, even family members. Yet through it all, he still couldn't see that Sean Malloy, the man who remained by his side, was quietly feeding information to the authorities. While Mick's empire rotted from within, Sean's reports grew more detailed, giving investigators everything they needed to bring him down. The fall of Rex marked the beginning of the end. Without his oldest ally, Mick became a king without a Ronin, ruling over fear, but with no one left to truly follow him. The empire that once controlled Liverpool's streets was collapsing faster than he could hold it together, and he didn't yet realize that the final betrayal was already underway. By the time 2010 arrived, Michael Mick Doran's world had begun to collapse entirely. The failed shipments, Rex's arrest, and internal betrayals had left him isolated, paranoid, and vulnerable. Once feared across Liverpool, he now saw enemies everywhere. Every phone call, every knock at the door, felt like a threat. The docks, the streets, even some of his longtime lieutenants were no longer reliable. Mick's empire, built on fear and precision, was crumbling, and the cracks were widening at an alarming pace. His desperation led him to plan his boldest move yet, relocating his operation abroad. Dubai, he decided, was the perfect refuge. Many British crime bosses had escaped there, taking money, connections and power with them, often evading justice for years. Mick arranged for multiple safe houses, fake identities, and secret routes, determined to disappear before the authorities closed in completely. But what he didn't realize was that Sean Malloy's betrayal was about to strike its final decisive blow. For years, Sean had been quietly feeding information to the National Crime Agency, detailing shipments, bank accounts, and even Mick's escape plans. Every step Mick took was already anticipated, every decision reported, and every weakness documented. As Mick prepared for his flight, police surveillance intensified. Investigators tracked his movements, monitored his communications, and collected evidence from every angle. Simultaneously, Sean's testimony became the backbone of the largest organized crime case Liverpool had ever seen. He provided precise information about the inner workings of the gang, financial routes, shipment networks, and names of key operatives. It was enough to build airtight cases against the entire organization. The night before Mick was to leave for Dubai, police moved in. A team surrounded his Formby safe house, weapons drawn, ready for any resistance. Mick, unaware of the full extent of Sean's betrayal, attempted to destroy documents, burn cash records, and hide assets, but the officers were prepared. Every corner of the property had been secured and monitored. They found hidden safes, encrypted drives, and stacks of cash, all evidence of his sprawling drug empire. Mick was arrested quietly, swiftly, and without the chaos he had once commanded in Liverpool street. The arrests didn't stop at Mick. Over the next few weeks, dozens of his lieutenants, associates and distributors were taken into custody. Properties were seized, bank accounts frozen, and vehicles confiscated. The empire that had once spread fear across the city was dismantled in a matter of months. In court, Sean's testimony proved crucial, outlining every shipment, every payment, and every act of intimidation. His evidence left no room for doubt, and the legal system moved decisively. For Mick, The fall was total. From the streets of Liverpool to the docks and into his luxurious safe houses, he had once ruled unchallenged. Now, he faced life in prison, stripped of freedom, power, and influence. What he had built over a decade, wealth, fear, control, had been destroyed by the one person he thought he could trust. His empire, once considered untouchable, had been reduced to headlines and court records. Liverpool, meanwhile, watched the dramatic collapse of its most feared crime lord, understanding that the reign of terror was over, even if the shadows he cast would linger for years. By 2011, the story of Mick Doran and Ryan Rex Callaghan had reached its final, shocking conclusion. Mick was sentenced to life in prison, Rex was already serving decades, and Sean Malloy was safely relocated under witness protection. Liverpool had been stripped of its most notorious drug lords. And yet, the echoes of their reign remained in every street corner, every neglected estate, and in the memories of the city's residents. The empire that had once ruled with fear and precision had been dismantled, but the consequences of its violence and corruption lingered far longer than anyone could have predicted. The communities that had been controlled by Mick and Rex were left in disarray. Addiction rates had soared during their reign, and many young people who had grown up under their shadow struggled to find hope or direction. Jobs were scarce, and many who had worked for the gang found themselves without income, without protection, and in danger from rival groups eager to claim abandoned territory. Former associates turned to smaller-scale drug dealing or petty crime just to survive, perpetuating a cycle of violence that would take years to break. Social services and police struggled to fill the void left by the gang's collapse, and Liverpool's reputation as a city haunted by organized crime lingered in national headlines. Despite the legal victory, the legacy of fear created by Mick and Rex remained strong. Residents spoke in hushed tones about the nights when the docks ran red, about men who vanished without explanation, and about the whisper of the brothers' names in pubs and alleyways. The psychological impact on the city was profound. People learned to avoid certain streets, young men were warned to stay away from the wrong crowd, and a general mistrust of outsiders permeated neighborhoods where loyalty had once been enforced through fear. For many, the story of Liverpool's deadliest drug lords was not just news, it was a lesson etched into memory. Even within prison walls, Mick retained a sense of influence. Letters smuggled in and out, coded messages, and the occasional visit from loyal supporters reminded him that his name still carried weight. Yet, without Rex, without Sean, and without the vast network of enforcement, his control was symbolic rather than practical. Authorities monitored these attempts carefully, ensuring that no resurgence could take place. The empire was gone, but the legend of its former rulers only grew, a cautionary tale about ambition, power, and betrayal. In the years that followed, Liverpool slowly began to change. New investments arrived, streets were regenerated, and community programs sought to offer alternatives to the cycle of crime. Yet the shadow of Mick and Rex's empire remained an uncomfortable reminder of how easily fear could dominate a city. Gangs inspired by their tactics emerged, but none matched the scale, sophistication, or ruthlessness of the Doran Callaghan operation. Ultimately, the story of Liverpool's deadliest drug lords is one of power, greed, and betrayal. A story where the rise was spectacular, but the fall was inevitable. Mick and Rex had built an empire from nothing, but in the end, they underestimated the reach of law enforcement and the quiet courage of the one man who turned against them. The city survived, battered but resilient, and the streets learned a lesson in fear that would echo long after the last shipment had been seized and the last prison sentence handed down. Liverpool had witnessed the birth and collapse of a criminal dynasty, and its story would remain a warning for generations to come.